The rain had been falling over Ohio since morning, turning the streets of the small town of Maple Creek into ribbons of gray. Inside the Sunrise Diner, the windows fogged up from the warmth of coffee pots and sizzling grills. Maria Alvarez had worked there for 6 years, long enough to know every regular by name and every squeak in the old wooden floor. It was just past 7 in the evening when the bell above the door jingled. Maria looked up from wiping down a table and saw a boy standing in the doorway, soaked from head to toe. He looked about 8 or 9 years old, his sneakers falling apart at the seams, his jacket too thin for the cold October rain. He didn't come inside fully. He just stood near the entrance, shivering, his eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. "Sweetheart, come in. You're letting the cold in," Maria called gently, waving him over. The boy hesitated. I don't have any money," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just wondering if maybe I could have some water. And maybe if there's food nobody wants." Maria's heart tightened. She had 2 kids of her own at home, and she couldn't imagine either of them standing in the rain, hungry and ashamed to ask for help. She walked around the counter and knelt down so she was at his eye level. "What's your name, honey?" "Tommy," he said. "Well, Tommy, you don't need money here. Sit down. You're going to catch a cold standing in that wet jacket." She led him to a booth by the window and grabbed a towel from behind the counter to dry his hair. Then she disappeared into the kitchen and came back minutes later with a steaming plate of pancakes, eggs, and bacon, along with a tall glass of milk. Tommy stared at the plate like he hadn't seen food in days. These, all for me. All for you," Maria smiled. "Eat as much as you like." As he ate, Maria noticed the holes in his shoes, the way his socks were soaked through, the way his hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. She sat across from him while he finished his meal and asked, as gently as she could, where his parents were. Tommy's eyes dropped to the table. He explained that his mother had lost her job a few months ago, and they'd been staying with a relative who didn't have much room or patience. Things had gotten difficult at home, and that evening, after a fight, he had walked out and lost track of how far he'd gone. He didn't have a phone. He didn't really know how to get back. Maria's manager, Mr. Douglas, had been watching from behind the counter. He came over and crouched beside the booth. "Do you know your address, son, or a phone number for your mom?" Tommy nodded slowly and recited a number with a shaky voice. Mr. Douglas called it right away. On the other end, a woman answered in a panic. Tommy's mother, Denise, who had been searching the neighborhood for over an hour, terrified something had happened to her son. While they waited for her to arrive, Maria wrapped a spare diner apron around Tommy's shoulders like a blanket and pulled a pair of clean, dry socks from the lost and found bin behind the counter. She even dug through a box of items customers had left behind over the months and found a pair of boys' sneakers, barely worn, that a family had donated the week before for a charity drive the diner was running. "Try these on," she said, kneeling to help him with the laces. They fit almost perfectly. When Denise arrived, drenched and out of breath, she rushed to hug her son so tightly he nearly disappeared into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she thanked Maria over and over. "He's no trouble at all," Maria said. "He's a good boy. He was just hungry and cold." Denise explained through tears that they'd been sleeping in her car for the past week after losing their apartment, too proud and too afraid to ask anyone for help. Maria didn't hesitate. She invited them both back to the diner's small break room to dry off and warm up. And while they did, she made some calls of her own to a local shelter she knew, to a church group that helped families find housing, and to a coworker who had a truck and could help move what few belongings they still had. That night, instead of letting them drive off into the rain, Maria brought Denise and Tommy to her own home. Her husband set up the guest room without a second thought, and her children happily shared their toys and comic books with Tommy, delighted to have a new friend. Maria cooked a real dinner, not a diner special, but a home-cooked meal. And for the first time in weeks, Tommy fell asleep in a warm bed, his stomach full and his mind at ease. Over the following weeks, with the shelter's help and the support of the diner's community food and clothing drive, Denise found a small apartment and a part-time job at a local laundromat. Maria checked in on them often, bringing groceries, hand-me-down clothes, and the kind of steady friendship that asked for nothing in return. Word of the story spread through Maple Creek, And soon regulars at the Sunrise Diner began leaving extra tips for Tommy's Fund, which Maria used to help other families who walked through those doors, hungry and afraid to ask. Tommy never forgot that rainy October night. The woman who knelt down to meet him at eye level, who saw not a stranger, but a child who simply needed someone to care. And Maria never forgot that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, a warm plate, a dry pair of socks, an open door, can change the course of someone's entire life.